Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for part two of our transformative three-part webinar series, From Data to Action, Shaping an Equitable Future, which is based on CCC's 2024 Keeping Track of New York City's Children Data Book, which was released earlier this year. My name is Jenny Velos. I'm a Policy and Advocacy Associate, and I will be hosting today's webinar along with my colleagues, excuse me, Rimshan Juan. For over 30 years, Keeping Track publication has provided detailed community-specific data to better understand the status and experiences of New York City's children, families, and communities, and inform calls to action to combat disparities and improve well-being. To better understand this data, we build out this series to focus on different issue areas, one at a time, by doing a deep dive on issues impacting children and families, affirming our belief that transparent, accessible data can and should play a fundamental role in collective efforts to ensure every child is healthy, housed, educated, and safe. We have seen firsthand how data can influence decision-making and directly shape the trajectories of children's lives. Over the course of this series, we'll explore the most pressing topics facing our communities, including economic security, which we covered last month, housing and homelessness, and early education and childcare, which we will cover next month. Our goal is to highlight the data that drives informed decision-making and actionable policies, ensuring that New York's children and families can thrive. So today, excuse me, we're going to dive into housing and homelessness with a focus on housing affordability, families and children in shelter, and homelessness prevention. With the election results, we know that there will be additional challenges to housing programs that are critical to helping families out of shelter and into permanent housing. This makes it all the more important for all of us to understand the issues, to collaborate, and to advocate. CCC will continue to hold government leaders, whether at the federal level, state level, and local levels, accountable to ensuring that children, youth, and families have the resources to find safe, stable, and affordable housing. With us, we'll have two knowledgeable speakers from our CCC staff who will provide analysis on these important issues. And following this presentation, we will have time for audience Q&A. You can use the chat or you can use the Q&A button. So now I'll welcome Juan and Rimsha, who will introduce yourselves to the audience.
Thank you, Jenny, for your introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Juan Diaz, and I'm a policy associate for housing and economic security. I will follow up my colleague Rimsha after her presentation with data. Thank you.
Everyone, it's a pleasure to be here with you. For those of you who don't know, my name is Rimsha Khan, and I'm a senior research specialist on the research and data team at CCC. I oversee the production of several key CCC data resources, including the data book, which we're talking about today, as well as the city and state child and family well-being indices. And with that, I'll move into the agenda for today. So in this presentation, I'm first going to talk about the 2024 edition of Keeping Track of New York City's Children, the data book, followed by a data presentation on trends in housing affordability and family homelessness. And then Juan will discuss policy and advocacy actions at the city and state level in the policy section. So for those of you who are new to the data book, this book provides a comprehensive account of the lives of New York City's children and families with data across multiple topics that highlight barriers to well-being. Using Census Bureau data and municipal data from New York City's agencies, my colleagues and I on the data team, which includes Christina Onea, Maria Drobniak, and we all delved into disparities along demographic and geographic lines to identify gaps in outcomes that have resulted from historical discrimination of marginalized groups, as well as disinvestment in certain communities. And this data is really meant to expand our knowledge on these issues facing families and children and inform legislative, budgetary, and advocacy actions that can help communities thrive. And the data book covers population data on the city's children, as well as having detailed chapters on economic security, housing security, homelessness, health, behavioral health, educational opportunities, and data specific to youth, as well as community and environment. And of course, today we'll be focusing on the housing chapter. And this book also has data at the community level, from zip codes to school districts, and an entire section on geographic profiles for each of the city's 59 community districts. So you can look up data for where you live or any other neighborhood that you're interested in. And these are great. These profiles are great for quick facts, or should you need them as cheat sheets to look up quick statistics. So as Jenny mentioned, we will be sharing the slide deck today with you after the webinar. However, we also encourage you to access the data book online on our website. You can download the entire book as well as separate chapters. I know the housing chapter was just shared in the chat. And also our Keeping Track online data tool, which contains many of the indicators that are discussed in the data book and today, and that provides breakdowns by different geographies in order to look at community well-being. Now, as we jump into housing data, I want to briefly talk about the framework that is used in CCC's analysis, since we're going to be discussing a lot of inequities and racial disparities. So to begin with, systemic inequalities and how we're looking at them today is through a model which some of you might be familiar with, which is called the social determinants of health, meaning that all of these system level factors, whether it's healthcare, education access, and quality, whether it's economic stability and the neighborhoods in which people live, their social and community context, these all come together to influence outcomes in people's lives. So I want to be clear when I talk about inequities, whether they're racial inequalities or gender inequalities, these do not stem from inherent differences in people. Instead, they are a result of systemic harm by policies and institutions, and they exist because marginalized groups in the US and our city have been blocked access to opportunities and resources. And we'll begin by talking about housing affordability. And a major factor in housing insecurity and instability is high rent costs. New York City, after all, is one of the most expensive housing markets in the world. And to set the context, let's look at trends in rent prices. Now, this chart is showing market rate prices from the real estate listing site, Street Easy. Using their data, I compared the median asking rent for a one-bedroom apartment, meaning if someone was to look for housing and they needed a place to rent, these are the prices they'd encounter across the 5 boroughs. I tracked rental prices by year over the past decade, looking at the month of August specifically. I have the New York City median rent depicted by the blue line. So taking a look at the city rent, in 2014, the city rent overall, the median asking rent was $2,750. And in this year, it has increased to $3,500. And when we look at it at the borough level, the most expensive borough by far is Manhattan, which is unsurprising. And Staten Island has overtaken the Bronx as the least expensive borough for rent, with a median asking rent of $2,000 in this past year. And in the Bronx, interestingly, the median rent basically doubled between 2014 and this year. This breakdown shows that there's definitely micro trends that are occurring in specific areas of the city, but overall, you can see that the median rents have consistently increased across the board, across the city. Now, this graph is looking at the availability of affordable housing by looking at the number of rental units based on their level of rent. So the dark blue is depicting units that are renting for under $1,000, which fell from over 1 million in 2010 to less than 500,000 in 2021. Yes, these units with low rents do still exist. Meanwhile, apartments renting for $2,000 or more nearly quadrupled in that same time frame. You'll see the number of these rentals went from 169,000 to 309,000 in 2016, jumping all the way to over 665,000 units that have higher rents. So the trends of rising rents combined with a diminishing number of low rent units have created a housing market that's hostile to families with low and even middle incomes where it's hard to find affordable housing. And we often measure housing insecurity by rent burden to depict the high cost of housing. Nearly 52% of households in the city pay more than 30% of their income on rent and are therefore considered rent burden. And there's another category of severe rent burden, which refers to situations in which households are paying more than half of their income on rent, and 30% of New Yorkers are severely rent burdened. Now, when broken down at the neighborhood level, the data shows disparities in rent burdens. The map is showing here in the dark blue areas higher rates when it comes to rent burden by community districts. And you can see that renters living in the outer boroughs, especially Brooklyn and the Bronx, are more likely to be rent burdened. And this is likely due to the higher proportion of residents in these areas who have low incomes, which of course rent burden is based on. High housing costs in the city, of course, place a huge burden on low-income households. And this chart is showing severe rent burden by household income level. And the income levels are based on the federal poverty level. You might recall this from the webinar last month, but as a refresher and for any new attendees, the federal poverty level is an income threshold that is used to determine eligibility for certain government benefits like SNAP, Medicaid, and so on. So using the federal poverty level, we can see that 74% of families in poverty and 49% of families near poverty are in the severe rent burden category. The citywide rate overall is 30%, which is shown at the bottom by the gray bar. And that number, that citywide average, is mostly driven by households with low incomes, which are disproportionately affected. And one of the concerning effects or impacts of high rental prices is overcrowding, and families are increasingly squeezed out into the outer boroughs or even beyond in some cases. So this chart on the left is looking at the rate of overcrowding by household type and race. A rental unit is considered overcrowded if there is more than one occupant per room. That doesn't include bathrooms or kitchens. So for instance, if there's a family of 4 in a 2-bedroom apartment with a living room, that's 4 people per 3 rooms, and that's considered an overcrowded unit. And the data shows that overcrowding is significantly more common among families with children across the board, and that's shown by the gray circles here. For instance, 12% of renter households in New York City are overcrowded, but when it comes to families with children renting, the share is even higher, with 30% of families living in overcrowded conditions. So citywide, almost a third of families across the city are overcrowded. Asian and Pacific Islander households and Hispanic households have the highest rates of overcrowding, 48% and 34% respectively. And this might be due to more intergenerational living, like having grandparents in the home, but that still requires adequate living space. So it is still an issue. To the right, there is a chart that's highlighting the neighborhoods with the highest rates of overcrowding. Elmhurst, Corona, and Jackson Heights in Queens Sheepshead Bay, Coney Island, and Borough Park in Brooklyn, as well as Concourse High Bridge in the Bronx. Housing conditions also play an important role in housing stability and security, and this map is showing housing maintenance complaints across community districts as a ratio, which is per 1,000 units. For example, in the North Shore neighborhood of Staten Island that you can see in the dark gray area here, there are 176 maintenance complaints for every 1,000 housing units. And if you look at the legend and the category breakdowns, that falls in the middle category of 119 to 260 complaints per every 1,000 units that are there. The majority of housing complaints are concentrated in under-resourced neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods have a higher proportion of households and families with low incomes. Areas with poor housing conditions include the Bronx, Central Brooklyn, and Northern Manhattan. And these are also areas which have public housing for people with low incomes, and that is partly contributing to more maintenance complaints than the city average. Instability in housing also leads to evictions, and residential evictions have increased post-COVID. This chart on the left is showing residential evictions in recent years. And during the height of the COVID crisis between 2020 and 2021, there was an eviction moratorium, which is why you see that sudden drop. So that meant that landlords could file for evictions, but they couldn't remove residents from their rentals. And then when the eviction moratorium was lifted in January of 2022, evictions started increasing again from that date. And you can see that over 12,000 in 2023, with the numbers increasing, continuing to increase in the current year. And on the right, you'll see a breakdown of evictions by borough during 2022 and 23. The Bronx and Brooklyn have the highest number of evictions. Both are above 5,000 in terms of evictions that took place. And with that, I'll move into talking about family homelessness. So while homelessness is a citywide issue, most people might not know that the vast majority of those who are experiencing homelessness are families and their children, especially young children. The pie chart shows the breakdown of families with children who are served in Department of Homelessness Services, or DHS, shelters in fiscal year 23. And if you add up the two categories for ages 0 through 5 and ages 6 through 13, 46% of this population, of the total population in shelters, are children aged 13 or younger. In the past year, the shelter population overall reached an all-time high for the city. As of the beginning of this year, there were over 46,600 children in shelters across New York City. So that includes all types of shelter systems and not just DHS, which we looked at in the previous slide. And this chart shows the breakdown of the number of children across these different shelters. So there were over 33,000 children in DHS shelters, followed by the second highest number of children, more than 10,800 in humanitarian, emergency response and relief centers, which house asylum seekers and migrants in particular, and over 2,000 children in HRA shelters, which also includes emergency domestic violence shelters. Homelessness disproportionately impacts Black and Hispanic children and families living in poverty. And this chart compares households in shelters to the households in the rest of the city by race. So for instance, 20% of family households are Black in New York City, But in shelters, 36% of heads of households are Black. The same goes for Hispanic households, where they make up 33% of the city's population, but make up 58% of the shelter population. So you can see that Black and Hispanic families are disproportionately in these shelters. Another aspect of family homelessness is domestic violence. Our partners at New Destiny Housing recently published a report over the summer, and that found that one of the leading causes for family homelessness is domestic violence, or DV. DV shelters are meant to be emergency shelters and have a maximum stay of 180 days. And the chart shown here is looking at where those people who have exited DV shelters end up going. The categories are DHS shelters or another shelters having their own arrangements, or permanent housing. Many of the people in these shelters also come with their children. So this includes the child population as well. The majority of people are simply cycling back into the shelter system. So you can see from the exits, more than 50% of exits from DV shelters after that temporary period is over, 50% of them transition to another shelter, which becomes a shelter-to-shelter pipeline. And that statistic combines the 30% going to DHS shelters and the 23% exiting to other city shelters. And lastly, this chart shows two different trends regarding families in shelter. There are more families with children in homeless shelters, but the average length of stay has decreased according to the most recent data. On the line chart on the left, you'll see the number of families with children in shelter was declining prior to the pandemic. And you'll see between fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 21, there was a sharp decline, and that was due to the COVID crisis, likely due to the eviction moratorium as well. However, in the past fiscal year, which runs July to June, the number of families in shelter has shot right back up, exceeding even pre-pandemic levels, due to several factors, including evictions that are back to being continued again, and of course, high rents or rental arrears. The average length of stay for families with children decreased to 437 days in shelter from a high of 534 days. And I believe the latest Mirrors Management report that came out earlier this fall shows the latest number that it declined even further to an average of 354 days in shelter for families with children in fiscal year 24. And this is partly due to the 90-day rule or length of stay requirement being overturned. That rule basically required or used to require 90 days in shelter before people could apply for housing vouchers, and that was overturned. And Juan will talk more about the policy perspective on housing, so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Rimsha, for such a detailed presentation, which helps me illustrate how data is so important in our advocacy, how government action or inaction can definitely impact families with children. As Rimsha shared in the last slide, the 90-day rule, which was part of advocacy from CCC and several advocacy organizations throughout the city, partners that we work together, and also the eviction moratorium during the pandemic, show how government action can impact the life of families with children. Again, my name is Juan Diaz. I'm a policy associate for housing and economic security at CCC. Prior to joining CCC, I worked as a supervisor at a homeless prevention program called Homebase, which is a homeless prevention program that also provides aftercare services, and it's funded by this City of New York, the Human Resources Department. I saw firsthand how policy actions and administrative barriers can impact the families with children. If we can move into the next slide, please. Again, so before I move into policies, I would like to talk about how CCC's housing advocacy strategy, we recognize the importance of coalitions, right? We recognize how important it is to have partners throughout the city. CCC being an independent organization, we don't provide services. It's important to have partners that are shelter providers, children welfare organizations, social service organizations, and therefore we are in constant meetings with them. We are co-conveners of the Family Homeless Coalition, a coalition that is 20 members that also have individuals with lived experience. Through our efforts, we're able to connect with city agencies, have quarterly meetings, testify, and impact policies throughout the city. We're also active members of a statewide anti-poverty coalition called the New York Can End Child Poverty, where we also advocate for housing reforms at the state level, in addition to economic reforms that can also impact the housing stability of families with children. Additionally, we're part of city coalitions that look to end shelter state provisions and also to expand housing vouchers throughout the state. I'll talk more during the policy presentation. Again, we're data-driven. With fact and data-driven is important when we testified or we talk to elected officials to inform them with data in their communities, data that impacts families with children, and data how their actions can also impact the well-being of families with children. We do with community outreach, like today. We conduct presentations, we mobilize youth, we mobilize members, board members, and people throughout the community to rallies, events, and presentations like today. We, as a co-convener family coalition, we recognize 3 pillars of advocacy. One is prevention and aftercare. Prevention and aftercare means that we are looking to make sure that there are policies that prevent entering into shelter. Families that are constantly at risk of homelessness, we are looking, to advocate for policies that prevent that. And aftercare is the services that is provided to families that exit shelter. Normally it's for 18 months, and it's very important. It gives families stability in the community. When families have to enter shelter, we make sure that with our partners, we advocate for policies for the well-being of children, students that are impacted severely by the stay in the shelter, and also to ensure that once families are in the community in shelter, there are policies and subsidies that enable them to move out of shelter. And finally, we also recognize the need to increase affordable housing in the city, increase access to affordable housing, and improve the services so families can move into the community. We can move into the next slide, please. Okay, so at the city level, as I mentioned, one of our cores is prevention and aftercare. We are, for this next fiscal year, we're looking into constantly advocate for an increase in funding for home-based. Home-based providers, as I mentioned, I worked at home-based for several years, are in constant need of more resources. They are vital providers of social services, housing prevention, legal services in the community, and their funding has been flat, meaning that for the last 8 years, the funding has been the same, even though the need for services has increased, especially during the pandemic and post-pandemic. So we're looking and advocating, working closely with the city council to increase funding by $39 million annually, which will bring the funding to approximately $100 million each year for each home-based location. We're also looking to continue advocating for the implementation of city FEPS expansion, which was passed into a law. It's currently pending at a New York City Housing Court, but the expansion of city FEPS will remove strict requirements like shelter history, housing, a housing court eviction case. Like many families do not have that. Many families have not been in shelter. So we're looking into continue partnering with agencies and with elected officials to continue pushing administration to pass, fund, and and administer the collection of CDFAPs. Additionally, during the pandemic, many legal organizations were able to process and submit CDFAPs applications for their clients. Organizations like the Legal Aid Society were able to complete the process, the packages, and not refer them to home base during the pandemic. This helped expedite cases, prevent evictions. So we're looking for reforms to allow legal organizations to also submit and process CDFAPs packages. Now, we're also looking to push the city to create a separate funding for aftercare services. As I mentioned before, aftercare means that for families and individuals that move out of shelter, we want to provide them stability in the community with resources, referrals, trainings, and we're looking to have a separate funding to ensure that there are specific programs for our aftercare for at least 18 months for families in the community. And before I move into the next slide, I just want to recognize that when we advocate, it's not necessarily a budget. We're not necessarily asking for funding. Some reforms, all they need is authorization from the city or fixes, administrative fixes in social services agencies. Next slide, please. Now, if families have no other choice but to enter a shelter, we are strongly opposing the implementation of shelter status limits for new arrival families. So there's a current law that it was implemented by the city administration that basically allows for 60 days for families with children, migrant families with children, to stay in shelters. After 60 days, they have to move out of shelters, reapply, and oftentimes these families have to wait on the street for several days. And when they are finally admitted back into the shelter system, they are placed in a different borough. Children that are attending a brown school suddenly have to travel far away from Queens and transfer in the middle of the school year to another school. Again, lack of documentation, language access, and 60 days are not sufficient for case managers to assist them with the several applications that they need. Especially now with the new federal administration, these families are in constant fear, not just from the city administration enforcement, but from potential deportations. So that's why also we'll be advocating for legal assistance for migrant families, so to ensure that the children of these families that are the future of the city, and many mixed status families with American-born citizens are not impacted by federal enforcement. We're also looking to advocate for an increase in DHS shelter providers funding and increase in salaries for shelter personnel. I work in social services and it's a really difficult work. It takes a lot. There's burnout. So we want to make sure that they are paid accordingly so we can continue to maintain adequate staff and the adequate staff deliver social services. And also, before families are placed into the shelter system, they have to go through the PAD system. There's a PAD center in the Bronx. Unfortunately, families with children have to endure difficult situations while they're PAD. One is that they have to provide 2 years of housing history. They have to have proof of where they have been for the last 2 years. And we know that is very difficult. We know that oftentimes families have been staying with family members, friends, and they have moved. They're not allowed in connection with them. So we're advocating closely with City Council to ensure that, yes, there's a need for housing history, but to reduce it from 2 years to 1 year. As I mentioned, some policies do not require funding. It requires common sense, and to ensure that families do not have to endure these traumatic experiences. And also, by improving this, by ensuring that the salaries of staff are adequate, it will reduce the waiting time for interviews. Next slide, please. Again, as I mentioned, also another pillar of CCC advocacy is ensuring that families with children have more access to affordable housing. And we talk about affordable housing, we know that the vacancy rate of the city is below 2%, 1.4 actually. So there's not that many affordable apartments for families that are in shelter or in overcrowded, over 100,000 students are overcrowded in the city, but there are specific reforms that the city can take. And one of it is to continue to improve the removal of zoning restrictions to ensure that there's more density in the communities and there's more affordable housing. Recently, due to advocacy at the state level, the state government authorized the city to convert unused commercial units into affordable housing and also to legalize basement. To do that, now the city has the authorization, so now it's time for action and to include funding into regulations, remove red tape to ensure that unused commercial units after COVID, many commercial businesses moved out or reduced their space. There's plenty of commercial units, so we can, the government can help developers, authorize developers to convert them into affordable housing and also to legalize basements in the community. And also to reduce barriers of voucher administration. For instance, many of you might work in social services. You know how long it takes for an apartment to be inspected by the city administration, or the delays in paperwork, too many papers, or sending a client to HRA to have a single issue. A single issue is, for those who are not aware, when you're applying for city FEPS, you need an active cash assistance case. Even though it's temporary, it usually lasts about anywhere to 2 weeks to 4 weeks. Clients have to go into HRA and apply for this. But oftentimes when the process of the application is ongoing and you need paperwork, it expires. So now clients have to go back to HRA and reapply. So we're asking for an extension instead of 30 days to 90 days to ensure that the paperwork is completed on time. And there are many more barriers, administrative barriers, that can significantly reduce costs, from prevention from legal cases and also for rental arrears, right? We're also looking to more funding to push back on income discrimination. Income discrimination is very prevalent. As I mentioned, I work at home base for several years, and many families with children that have a city FEPS or a FEPS or Section 8 housing voucher enhanced are discriminated because many landlords will not accept a housing voucher. This is discrimination, and there's the Human Rights Commission in New York advocates for these families, so we need more legal assistance to support them. As I mentioned, these are city-wide policies, but we also understand the role that the state government has in assisting the city and also providing more support, not just with authorization, but with funding. So at the state level, we're also, as I mentioned, we're part of statewide coalition. We advocate for the state to be a city partner in pushing back on regulations and also providing more funding. With other groups, we are constantly advocating for the state to fund a statewide housing voucher that will be similar to Section 8, but it will be more inclusive. It will provide assistance for foster youth living, becoming independent. It will provide assistance to immigrant families, and the income threshold will be much higher than the current threshold that it has on city FEPS or Section 8. So we are continuing to advocating for the inclusion of a statewide housing voucher. Additionally, the shelter allowance, the cash assistance and shelter allowance, which is a grant that is provided for families who have a cash assistance case, has been the same for over 2 decades. The shelter allowance that provides assistance for family has not increased in the last 20 years. So imagine the housing costs, the ongoing living expenses that families have, and shelter allowance has been the same. So we're also continually for the last 2-3 years to advocate for the increase of public benefits for families with children. And lastly, we recognize that the state has both an obligation and also should be committed to increase funding for rental assistance at the city level and also to assist New York City with shelter costs. Unfortunately, in the last decade, New York State has reduced funding for rental assistance and for shelter costs, which means that the city, New York City government, every year has to increase their funding for shelter costs and also for rental assistance. Thank you. On the next slide, please. And as I mentioned, we are constantly advocating at state level. And this coming Tuesday, November 19th at Albany, CCC and other community organizations statewide will be at the state capitol to advocate for a package that includes a statewide housing voucher, an increase in tax credits for children, enhancements of public benefits, increase in funding for childcare, universal meals for schools, and also an increase in food supports. The information is there. We'll also provide a link that will provide that information. If those who cannot attend are also invited to join us online or through social media. CCC will be there as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan and Rimsha, for this amazing presentation. And it just emphasizes the work that needs to be done for children and families to just have stability in housing. So now we will get to some questions. There are some questions in the chat. I'm going to start with, give me 1 second. Here we go. So Juan, this question may be for you. So Jama had a question. How much of the government funding for housing originates from the federal government? And sorry, get to the question again.
And how it would impact.
And so how much of it originates from the federal government? And what do you anticipate will be the impact on funding for housing and homelessness services in New York City under the Trump administration?
Well, that's a great question. That's a question that advocates throughout the city have been looking at. I mean, we're constantly, before the election, we have been constantly advocating for more resources from the city, from the state, and from the federal government. Now, let me just explain these. With federal government, there are programs that are entitlements. Entitlements are programs like SNAP, like food stamps, where the government must allocate funding for population that's eligible to receive food stamps, cash assistance, SNAP. I'm sorry, SNAP. However, for housing and even for cash assistance, the TANF program, these are not entitlement programs. What the federal government provides are grants. Each state receives $16.6 billion in yearly grants from the temporary assistance for needy families. And from that, each state decides, how they utilize that funding. For instance, in New York City, a portion of their funding for city FEPs, for cash assistance, comes from TANF funding. The federal funding goes into the state. New York State then allocates the funding to different localities. Unfortunately, the cash assistance, TANF, and the HUD Section 8 funding has been flat for the last 8 years. Which I would say flat, I'm referring to it has been the same, right? For instance, for Section 8, the funding is $67 billion yearly for the entire nation. New York State receives a large portion because there's a large portion of Section 8 vouchers in the state, and 30% of that funding goes into project-based Section 8, in short, NYCHA. So, and as we know, the issues that that NYCHA residents have to go through. So, for instance, this year, the city administration allocated $2 billion for the next 2 years for capital funding. Capital funding means repairs or approvals of NYCHA units. What does that mean for the city? If the state continues to allocate the same funding, the city, as has been doing every year, the city will increase their allocation of funding for TANF. Unfortunately, that can impact other programs, right? That can impact other programs that the city might not be able to fund. Now, the city, fortunately, New York State, New York City are at the forefront nationwide when it comes to housing, when it comes to social services. But again, if the need continues to increase and the cost of living continue to increase, it means that both the city and the state have to allocate more funding. And that means an impact in other programs. So I don't foresee an impact on housing in the next 3-4 years, because this, for instance, the city recently baselined. Baseline means that the city allocated funding for the next 5 years for city FEPs, over $500 million in the next 5 years, an increase of $500 million. So for at least for city FEPs and some programs, there's funding. Now, if we're talking about the expansion of city FEPs or other programs, the city will need funding for that. And unfortunately, if the government continues to allocate the same funding, again, the city and the state will have to allocate that funding.
Thank you, Juan. And just a follow-up question to that, how will the coming administration affect CCC strategy and coalition strategies around funding for housing?
Thank you. Great question. Absolutely. We'll continue to do our work. We'll continue to partner with state elected officials, but most importantly, we will strengthen our relationship, our partnership with immigrant-led organizations. So it's unfortunately, it's oftentimes it's not about certain policies that we want, but we want to keep families in New York City, New York State, because many children that are American-born children, mixed status, can be impacted by potential strict enforcement at the federal level.
Thank you. And just for everyone here, if you want to ask a live question, please raise your hand and we will make sure that you will unmute yourself. Just looking at the chat, we did have a comment from Kevin, who is asking, or who commented how everything spikes heavily during the pandemic. So I don't know, Kevin, if you have more to add to that, or if you have possibly a follow-up question.
Oh, it was just an observation.
Okay.
That it just like that everything decides to coalesce around the pandemic area and just rapidly spiked up in the time of when people needed the most help.
Correct. Yes, Kevin. There was government assistance, state moratoriums, even child tax credits that just provide assistance for families, more rental assistance funding in the form of, there was a program called ERAP, an emergency rental assistance program. Unfortunately, those programs expired a year ago. So that, unfortunately, that's one of the CCC's strengths is to continue to maintain that funding. Look where funding expire or has decreased, that's where CCC and partners are continually advocating for.
Thank you for that information, Juan. Another question we have, and Remsha, this may be directed towards you. Do you have census and other data on the HERC shelters? And this question is from Arthur.
Great question. Census Bureau wouldn't doesn't track data on HERC centers, but that is available through the city's open data portal. That is published in one of the reports. I can get you the name of the report in the follow-up, but there is more data at the city level that delves into the numbers for HERCs.
Thank you, Rimsha. And so next I have a comment and a question from Sarah. So Sarah's comment was that another factor for a decrease in evictions during and immediately after could be the federal income subsidies that lifted families out of poverty. And so Sarah's question was on the child homeless slide. How are you defining children under 18 and under 13? And Sarah, if you want to unmute and
Yeah, I just did. So there were two slides where the term children was used in the homelessness section, and it wasn't clear to me how you were defining children, whether it was, were you defining them as under 13 because you had talked about that specifically previously, or are you defining children as under 18 on those slides?
So for the first slide, where I had the DHS shelter breakdown, that was specifically about young children, where I spoke about the age groups. So that was children 13 or younger. So that falls under the category of, in this context, young children.
Yeah.
Now, the following slide that was across the shelter system in the city, that is the typical definition of children under 18. So that's all children under 18.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're on mute, Jenny.
thank you for that. So we have another question from Amanda. How much power does HRC have to hold landlords accountable when they refuse to take vouchers?
They unfortunately, it's a lengthy process, and by the time oftentimes family have to find an apartment, they already have gone into other units, but it takes several months. But yes, the city administration has been able to locate several landlords, developers, small landlords, and give them fines and ensure that they are accepting these vouchers. But it's a lengthy process. That's why it's important to allocate more funding during the pandemic, especially due to many vacancies issues at the city level. This department was underfunded and did not have that many capacity, but now more than ever it's so important with to ensure that the funding that is allocated for these housing subsidies is used, and therefore landlords need to continue. And oftentimes there's misinformation about housing subsidies, and that's why oftentimes landlords are hesitant to accept the vouchers. But that's what this agency does. They're just not there to enforce or put fear, but also to inform landlords about the benefits of housing vouchers and how they work, because many times landlords are not well informed about the housing vouchers.
So we have a couple of more questions. One question is from Laura. Can you define shelter allowance? Is that for shelters or for clients?
Great. Yes, thank you. So the shelter allowance grant, it's part of a cash assistance case. Let me give you an example. If a family with children has a cash assistance case and receives, let's say, $300 in cash assistance, and if they're also renting an apartment or residing at NYCHA, they can also receive what's called the shelter allowance. Basically, the city administration, HRA, will send two checks, one on the 1st, the other one on the 15th, bi-monthly, with approximately, let's say, $250, $125 on the 1st and $125 on the 15th, to assist families that have a cash assistance with rent. There's also the utility grant that also some families are also some families also benefit from. But again, the shelter allowance has not increased in over 2 decades. Imagine the high cost of rent. Let me give you an example that I saw many times while I worked at Homebase. Let's say a family that depending on social security income, and their rent was $300. Their portion of rent was $300, but their income was $800, $900. The shelter allowance of $150 basically allowed them to lower their cost of rent. But if the shelter allowance continues to be small, leaves with families with children with less cash, with less money to use for essential items that they can, help support. So anytime we talk about rent, and the ideal number is 30%, is to provide families with that extra money, extra cash, so they can use in other items, and not have to think I have to pay 50% of my income towards rent. So this month I'm not going to buy a code or a laptop for my child that needs for education. So that's why it's important for families to have these supports. That's so important.
Very important to have supports and resources that are accessible to families. And I think our final question is from Gemma again. And she wants to know if there's anything that small civic or community groups can do in addition to participating in advocacy efforts.
Absolutely. Aside from, following CCC, and it's important to follow your local elected officials. At the local level, we have city council members, we have state elected officials, assembly members, senators, town halls. Also be informed when there's going to be a testimony at the city level, city council oversight hearings, and stay informed. And whenever you have the opportunity to participate on e-action, right, to demand new reforms on elected officials to do so. So there are more ways to be active in advocacy and not just attending, some events, but definitely staying informed.
On that note, thank you so much, Rimshan Juan, for an amazing presentation. I echo what everyone has said in the chat. It was great. The information was so informative. We need to kind of realize there's the many resources that are needed. Again, for families to have safe, stable, and affordable housing, just super important, especially for younger children, for families, so that there's stability in their lives. So thank you all who were able to join us today. We will be following up with materials from this webinar in the following weeks, as well as steps to get involved in our advocacy efforts, in our events. And we also want to remind people to please remember to RSVP to part 3 of the series, if you haven't done so already. Part 3 will be covering early education and childcare, and it will be taking place on Friday, December 13th at 12 p.m. So with that, I want to thank everyone for joining. Have a great day and a great weekend.
You all.